you certainly would like, I hope you would. You could turn with me to Genesis 37. I'm going to read the whole chapter 37. Don't go anywhere because after that there's one verse from chapter 39. I don't know if it's maybe it will. Or you can follow along the screen. 37, chapter 37. So Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any other of them, they hated him, and he couldn't speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you have? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They had moved on from here," the man answered. I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.' So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal will devour him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert. But don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe that he was wearing. And they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in the morning will I go down to the grave, or in mourning will I go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Turn to 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. God bless his word.
So, A Cup of Joe, Bringing the Heat, is the name of this series. But it has nothing to do with the messages that I'm going to preach on. It is actually just a weekly reminder I want to give you that we're starting on December 4th a brand new community outreach called Monday Morning Coffee. And what we're going to do is we're going to serve coffee out of our parking lot. We have a drive-in, drive-out pattern where people in our community on Monday mornings in December, January, and February, we're going to serve coffee. Monday morning coffee. That's really what it is, period. We're going to love our community by serving coffee, and our leadership team has embraced this idea, and we're going to really try it, and there's going to be kinks, and there's going to be problems, but we believe God is in it, and this is going to be a way that we're going to bless the community. And so, Monday morning coffee, starting December the 4th, and it's from 6:30 a.m. to 8:30, or whenever we get tired or we run out of coffee. So that's what the title is of the series is. It's called A Cup of Joe, just to remind me to tell you about this outreach. But actually, on second thought, this series is about a guy named Joe. And honestly, I think this series is about destiny. We're going to talk about destiny for the next 4 weeks. And we're talking about destiny because we believe destiny is that which is going to happen in a person's life in the future. And there are good things and there's bad things that take us to where we need to be, where our destiny is. And so if you promise to stay awake for the entire sermon, I'll give you the punchline now. Here it is. Every day, in every way, and even every stay, God is moving you and I towards our destiny. And when we know that God is moving us towards our destiny, it allows us to trust His hand in the midst of all the situations. Now, Joe had a destiny. And in the midst of his destiny, on the way towards his destiny, there were various days. And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about these various days towards his destiny. And today, we're talking about the pity days. Next week will be the prison days, and the third week's the promotion days, and then posterity days. But in order to talk about Joseph, we've got to talk a little bit about his family. He came from a really dysfunctional family. You thought your family was dysfunctional? Wait till you hear about his. So his father, Jacob, was a pretty crazy guy. He was a trickster. He was a manipulator. He really was, Joseph was one of 12 kids. And he was one of a family with 4 wives. So there was 4 wives made up 12 kids. And he was one of the last kids born. He's one son younger than him named Benjamin. But this one family, they had one son who had relations with one of the other wives. 2 of the brothers were mass murderers, and this is how they murdered people. So basically, their sister was raped. And so they were so mad that their sister was raped. What they did is they went into this village and they convinced all of the adult men in the village to get circumcised. And while they had their bag of keys on their sensitivities, they went in and killed them all. That's how they mass murdered everybody. They mass murdered everybody. I mean, this is how dysfunctional they were. But there was a beginning to this story, and it was in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 or 2. There was a man named Abram. And Abram was given a promise. And here's what Abram said. It said that God said to Abram, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. And whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. Now, Abram was chosen by God to lead the people of Israel, the chosen people. He was given a promise that God was going to bless his people. He was going to make his name great. He was going to be the beginning of a great nation. Well, Abram had a son named Isaac. And Isaac had 2 sons. And one of those 2 sons' names was Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons. And one of those 12 sons was Joseph. And so Joseph was part of a dysfunctional family, but he was also part of God's plan. This may not be the family that you would choose to have a spiritual hero rise up in. But God planted a vision and a promise, and there were no circumstances that could or would change that. Here's what I want to tell you today. Your circumstances will never change or alter God's providence. No matter where you're at, no matter what you're going through, no matter what your heritage is, no matter how bad your parents were, no matter this, no matter that, nothing can change and alter the providence of God. See, it says that Jacob loved Joe the most. Now, we know a little bit more about Joseph in that basically 25% of the Genesis, the book of Genesis, is written about Joseph and his story. And so what we know is that Jacob basically worked 7 years to marry this beautiful lady named Rachel. And after 7 years of working for Rachel's hand in marriage, he was tricked into marrying her sister that was not as beautiful. So he had to work another 7 years. And then they finally got married, and then they had 2 kids, and Ben and Joe were the kids that came out of that marriage. But there was something special in Jacob for Joseph. And the reason why we know Joseph was special is because we know in the Word that it says that he was given this beautiful coat. This beautiful coat that signified that he was special. It was a long white linen robe embroidered with narrow strips of color. It was only worn by the wealthy and king's sons. It signified that this person had no need to toil for their living. That they were a person of inheritance, legacy, firstborn, exalted position. His brothers, the other 11, really the other 10, they had to wear short coats that wouldn't impede their limbs because they had to do a lot of running and working with the sheep. And so they had to have something that didn't impede their movements. But not Joseph. Joseph had a beautiful robe. And the presentation of this robe to Joseph signified that he would get special treatment. And he had no need to participate in the general labor. And see, that's why it's really important to set this up, because really when we read this story in Genesis chapter 37, we're not sure why these brothers hated him so much. I mean, come on, he had a nice wardrobe, his father liked him, but there was this deep animosity for Joseph. And why was that? It says in the Word that he was beautiful and he had a great build and he had this beautiful coat and he was a dreamer and he was his father's favorite. And all of these things combined created a great deal of hate in these 10 other brothers. It turns out that one of Joseph's main jobs was simply to be a reporter for his dad. That when the boys would be out in the pasture looking to take care of the sheep, Joseph's job was to go and look at what they were doing and come back and bring a report. And it tells us in verse 2 that he had already brought a really bad report. They must have been doing something wrong. And so Joseph goes and sees the 10 brothers doing something wrong, and he runs back and he snitches on his brothers. And so they already were upset. They were already upset with him. And now he starts sharing these dreams. Wait a minute, you're telling me you're 11 in a row of 12, and we're going to submit to you? You're going to reign over us? You're going to be exalted and we're going to be humiliated? And it seems, and maybe I'm reading a little bit into this, but it seems to me that the way Joseph carried himself may have been with a little bit of pride. It might have been with a little arrogance. It might have been with a little immaturity. And so this all goes into, they don't really like their brother at all. And so in verse 12, the scene is set. They don't like the brother. Now Jacob has asked Joseph to go again and check on these brothers of his. And so he takes the assignment and he starts heading out to a city where he thinks they are. And the jealous brothers see the spy. They see he's coming. And they said, you know what, we've had enough. This is going to be different this time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to just get him and we're going to kill him and we're going to throw him in this cistern and we're going to take his coat off and we're going to make a little blood on it. We're going to take it back to Dad and we're going to say, hey, listen, something happened to him. We don't know really what happened. We're sorry about it. But he got killed. So they plan to eliminate him, to toss his carcass in the empty cistern and blame it on the wild animals. Just a side note about sin. Maybe this is true in your life. That germ of jealousy that starts out really small, it turns into an infection of hatred, and then it turns into a full-blown disease of murder. Do you see how that happened? They were jealous. They were just a little upset about their brother, and then they decide that they're just angry, and it gets a little bit stronger, and then they finally say, you know what? Our anger's not satisfying. We're going to murder him. And here's something I want to point out. In verse 20, the last part of verse 20, it says this. When they decide to kill their brother, it says, then we'll see what comes of his dreams. We'll show him. He thinks he's the dreamer. We're going to show him. We're going to take care of the dreamer. We're going to take care of the dreams. They actually thought, listen to this, church, they actually thought they could change the plan of God. The brothers believed they could stop or alter the plans and the process of God's servants. What they didn't realize was the invisible hand of God in Joseph's life. Do you know that God is not referenced once in Genesis 37? Not once is he referenced. It's the invisible hand of God in Joseph's life that takes the plans to destroy the dreamer and uses them to actually fulfill the dreams. That's crazy. That should give us hope today. That no one, nothing, never can alter God's dreams imparted into your life. What God has put in you, no one, nothing, never can it be altered. Even you. I do a pretty good job of trying to alter God's plan for my life. But the word says that nothing. So you have Reuben, one of the brothers, that says, hey, listen, guys, come on, let's not get carried away. How about instead of murdering him, we'll just have him starve to death? We'll just throw him in this cistern. We won't kill him. So they go from homicide to starvation. Instead of killing him, they're just going to make him starve. And so in verse 23, he shows up. They rip, strip, and throw. They ripped off his coat. They stripped him of what mattered most to him. And I don't have time to explain this, but isn't it interesting? Sometimes the things that matter the most to us, the things that we try to hold on to most tightly, are the things that we lose. The things that just kind of go away. Because I think it's self-sufficiency. It's what's getting stripped away from Joseph was self-sufficiency. And so in verse 24, he finds himself in a what? pit. And thus begins the pity days towards destiny. Joseph is heading towards his destiny, but the first stop is a pit. What's a pit? A pit is a place that you and I can't get out by ourselves. You have a rebellious son or daughter. You've tried everything. It's a pit. I don't know what else to do. I've done everything I can. I have no clue what to do next. You're in a pit. How about an unresponsive or an unreasonable spouse? I can't do it for him. I can't take her any longer. You're in a pit. How about a mean boss? You've done everything. You go in early, you stay late, you do the things that nobody sees, but he's always on your back. It's a pit. Sometimes that pit is created by you, or sometimes that pit is created by someone else. See, what happens in the pit is hopeless and hungry hours. For Joseph, he found himself in a pit. And what that pit meant is that he was hopeless and he was hungry. There was nothing there for him. And maybe for you, it hasn't been just a hopeless and a hungry couple of hours. But maybe it's been a hopeless and hungry couple of weeks. Or worse, months. Maybe years. Maybe there's someone that it's been decades that you've been hopeless and hungry. And God takes Joseph, we're not going to like this, but it looks like this is true, that God takes Joseph to a place of apparent death in order to prepare him for life. That's a little bit deep. We don't have enough time to explain that. But think about that. He took Joseph all the way to what apparently was going to be his death in order to take him to the abundant life. So Joseph's in the pit. And he believes that his dreams are shattered. How could there be fulfillment of the promise while I'm in the pit? What he doesn't know and what he's going to figure out. And we have the context of looking before and after this passage. That we know that Joseph's on his way to his destiny. It's just the pity days towards his destiny. The problem was actually part of the fulfillment of the promise. The promise is true, church, even if the problem gets worse before the plan gets good. Do you understand that? The promise is true, even if the problem gets worse before the plan gets good. We believe that. That's the truth of the scriptures. So church, some of us here today may feel like we're in a pit. We may believe that the promises are gone. We've been disqualified. We're lost. We're ripped and we're destroyed. But I'm here to tell you today that the Word of God says that in the midst of the pits, the promise, the dream is still true and is still coming. And so when we're in the pit, if we only see the walls, if we only see the lack of food, if we only see the lack of health, if we only see the deficiencies, we may miss the hand of God leading us through these difficult times. Because remember, God can use anyone, everyone, anything, everything to move us closer to our destiny. Email me later if you feel like I'm not treating this scripture correctly. But this is what it says. That Joseph is on his way. I mean, read the rest. I mean, go to chapter 40, 41, 42, 43. I mean, keep going. We're going to get there later in the series. But you trust me, we're getting there. He ends up in a palace. He ends up winning. But right now, he's in a pit. And so, church, when we're in a pit, maybe we need to begin to ask questions, even if we weakly and hesitantly ask them. God, can you help my unbelief? God, can you quiet my doubts and my complaints? Can you give me eyes to see what I really can't see? I think in some ways it's about control. And when we get into situations where we think we've lost control, it might just be God's reminder that we never were in control. Well, when we get to the point where we feel like we don't have any control, we might just be in agreement with God that we never had control to begin with. Because sometimes, and this is the part we don't like, but this is the part that's true in the scriptures, that God had to do something in Joseph's life in order for him to fulfill the destiny. That there was some character development, and that God was using disappointments as part of Joseph's character development. And character development, unfortunately, is always part of destiny. He's always trying to prepare us. That God is not going to bring us into our destiny if we're not emotionally, spiritually, and even physically ready for it. Sometimes we use bad words like discipline, or correction, or trials, or training. But really, it's all the same word for God just developing you in order to step into what He has for you. Ruth Graham's epitaph. Do you know what it says? There's only a few words on Ruth Graham's tombstone. Here are the words. It says, "End of construction. Thank you for your patience." That's what it says. She realizes that God was doing something in her life, her entire life. And that only when she came to her last earthly breath was it complete. So, church, we need to keep allowing God to develop us even during the most pity times. Back to our story. So Joe's in the pit, and the boys decide to have lunch. And I can't make this up, it's in the Bible. A caravan shows up. Caravan? Is that a popular word these days? A caravan. A caravan. I mean, literally, it's in the Bible. It says a caravan showed up. Now, these folks in this caravan are Ishmaelites. They're actually relatives of the boys that are having lunch. I wonder what was said over lunch. What was said over the picnic basket to drown out the cries of their brother in the pit. How loud did they have to talk to ignore him saying, "Help! Someone get me out of here!" And the caravan shows up, and they realize that these Ishmaelites, coming from the east, heading to Egypt, had a lot of spices, had a lot of things that were only found back in their hometown and were very valuable in Egypt. And another thing that was really valuable in Egypt were slaves. And so they realized, hey, listen, we have something of value for these Ishmaelites. We'll take some of their goods and we'll give them our brother and we can dispose of him safely. And so Judah, one of the brothers, leads the discussion and they decide for 20 shekels that they would sell their brother. Come to find out that the going rate for a slave was 30 shekels. So not only were they terrible brothers, they were awful businessmen. They couldn't even make good money on selling their brother. So they sell him. And they cover it up by killing an animal. One thing that's not clear in this passage that I think is important is what is Joseph's reaction to all of this? Almost Jesus-like. You never hear of Joseph's reaction through this whole story. You actually have to dig back deeper go forward to Genesis 42:21 when at the end of the story, Joseph's retelling the story, and one of the things he says in the story is that he was distressed. He was distressed, and he was living with terror and anguish, and his pleadings were unheard. But we really don't know if he's terrified or he's begging, he's weeping, he's afraid, he's yelling, he's doubting, he's blaming, he's bitter, he's resentful. Church, what we know is Joseph was living large. He was well dressed. He was well positioned. He was primed for his next blessing. He was moving fast in the center of God's will. And the next minute, he's stripped, ripped, dethroned, alone, and now walking slowly, chained to a line of camels, heading to Egypt. And we know a desert is never anyone's destination. But even when you're in the desert, it doesn't change your destiny one bit. The dream and the promise is not altered even a little bit. It's actually God saying, I'm still leading you. I read this week of a story of a loggerhead turtle. Do you know what a loggerhead turtle is? A loggerhead turtle are these huge, massive turtles, somewhere between 350 and 1,000 pounds. And there's a story of one female that was heading up onto the sand dunes to lay her turtle eggs, and for whatever reason she got disoriented, and instead of after laying the eggs heading back to the water, she starts heading further inland, further up the sand dune. And the rangers, spotting that she's disoriented and knowing that she's massive in size, they had to do something to rescue her. And so what they did was they shackled her. They tied up her legs. They flipped her over on her shell. They hooked her up to a four-wheeler, and they dragged her back to the water's edge. Wait a minute. Disoriented, trapped, tied down, flipped over, and dragged? Not to harm her, but to get her back to where she needed to go. Church, there was no amount of yelling at this turtle that was going to get her to turn around. There weren't enough hand motions. There was no luring her with some food. Church, how many of us have ever said, "What are you doing, God? What are you doing to me? Where are you taking me? Why can't I understand? Why can't I see what you're doing?" And all too often, in our hurried, stressed out, self-help culture, we cannot hear that soft voice saying, "I'm taking you exactly where I need you to be. Trust me." So let's bring this in for a landing. There's a phrase that pulls this all together, that makes sense of this story. The phrase is actually found in the last words that Gary shared with us this morning. And those words are these: "And the Lord was with Joseph." Now, we're going to get into that next week, but we needed to share it today in order to tie up and wrap up the pity days towards destiny. God was with Joseph. Church, if you're sleeping, you want to wake up. God is with you. God is with you. He sent his son Jesus to show you. He sent his Holy Spirit to empower you. Let me say it this way. There's a story of a father who is holding on to his 3-year-old son, and they enter into a swimming pool. And it's one of those community pools that goes from shallow to deep. And so he begins to walk into the pool. And he's walking down towards the deep end. And the water just starts rising on their bodies. And the child is getting more and more panicked as the water gets higher and higher. Clinging more tightly, the Father's feet, we know this, right? The Father's feet are easily on the ground. The water's never going to get up over his head. If the boy really knew how secure he really was, there would be no reason for panic. The water's depth at any point in the pool was not going to be over the father's head. But here's the thing. At any point, that child on its own would have drowned. If it had been 3 foot up to 8 foot, it's not going to, it was going to drown at any point. The safety of the child depended on the father the entire time. People love to talk about rock bottom. You know who you meet at rock bottom? You meet the rock at the bottom. So often, and I'm not sure why this has to be, but we most often meet the rock at the bottom. And so I don't know if you're going through some pity days, but I'm sure that you're going towards destiny. But one place that every destiny has to pass is the cross. Did I ever tell you a story of why our cross is on the floor and not on the wall at our church? Is because every single person has to come to the cross. The cross on the wall, it really does become just a symbol. I want it to be something that we encounter. That's something that we realize the importance of. That we know that the cross is empty because Jesus, not only did he live, and not only was he crucified, but he defeated death and he's no longer on the cross. And so, church, today, I want you to know that there is nothing that is altering what God wants to do in your life. And so, like Joseph, you may be going through some pity days, but you're going towards destiny. God still has good things and good days in store for all of us. That's a wonderful promise. That's a wonderful truth that comes directly from the Word of God. Let's pray. God, today, we ask that you would draw near to us and that we would sense that no matter where we're at and what we're going through, that you are with us. Lord, I thank you for the story of Joseph. I thank you for the image that is depicted for us, and that how he was going through so much, and he was being tortured, and he was being mistreated. But all the while, you were moving him towards your plan and the fulfillment of your promise in his life. And so, Lord, I pray that over this congregation. I pray in Jesus' name that each one of us would realize today that no matter what day it is, we're going towards the fulfillment of the promise in our life. God, I pray that each one of us realizes the truth of that today, for us individually, and certainly for us collectively as a church. We trust you with everything. We ask you to have your way in us today. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Church, we have the privilege today